In Ithaca, New York, for many decades, there stood a pub named Rulloff's. To the unsuspecting visitor, it was merely another establishment, a quaint relic from a bygone era, a place for collegial chatter and the warmth of a hearth against the biting upstate winds. Its dark wood walls seemed to absorb the stories and secrets of the town, echoing with the laughter of university students and the solemn debates of professors. But for those who knew the local lore, the name Rulloff was not a tribute to a beloved founder or a town hero. It was a scar on the town's memory, a constant whisper on the lips of the community, a shadow that refused to fade into the quiet annals of history. The name belonged to the region's most infamous man, John Edward H. Rulloff. To call him a man of contradictions would be a gross understatement. He was a phenomenon, a terrifying paradox of human nature. By all accounts, a genius, a true polymath. A man whose intellectual capacity was described as prodigious, almost superhuman. Accounts from his time claim he was a qualified physician, a sharp-witted lawyer, a respected teacher, an innovative photographer, an inventor of intricate machinery, and even, in what might seem a whimsical footnote, a designer of elaborate carpets. It was whispered, with a mixture of admiration and dread, that he had mastered an incredible 28 distinct languages and dialects, a feat that would place him in the pantheon of the world's greatest philologists. He was, in many ways, the very embodiment of the Victorian ideal of the self-made scholar, a man who seemed to have conquered the vast expanse of human knowledge through sheer force of will. But beneath this brilliant, carefully constructed facade of erudition, a profound darkness festered. Behind the intense, penetrating eyes and the poised demeanor of a learned gentleman lay a moral void, an abyss of cold, calculated cruelty and depraved indifference. The New York Times, in an attempt to decipher this contradictory figure, delivered a scathing verdict after his capture, describing him as a man of great pretense and arrogant vanity, a thief as a boy, who spent 18 of his 51 years in prison, a bungler in crime, a charlatan in learning, and great only in depravity. And history would prove them tragically, horrifyingly correct. Today, we journey into the shadows to dissect the two lives of Edward Rulloff, the life of the celebrated intellectual who charmed academics, and the hidden life of the ruthless serial killer who extinguished lives with chilling detachment. This is the haunting story of a monster who hid in plain sight, a predator who weaponized his own genius. It's a story that culminates not just with a noose and a gallows, but with a brain, his brain, preserved in a glass jar, one of the largest ever recorded, now a macabre artifact that poses a question that continues to echo through the corridors of criminology. What truly lies within the mind of a genius of evil? Edward Rulloff's descent into infamy was not a sudden plunge, but a slow, deliberate erosion of morality, a path paved by arrogance and intellectual pride. Born in 1820 in St. John, New Brunswick, Canada, his early life was steeped in an oppressive poverty that stood in stark contrast to his boundless intellectual curiosity. From a young age, it was evident that Edward was exceptional. While other children engaged in youthful pastimes, he was found sequestered with books, devouring dense texts on science, history, and language with a disconcerting ease that baffled his teachers. His intelligence became his identity, his only real asset in a world that offered him little else, but it was an asset that would soon become a terrible curse. Hand in hand with his burgeoning intellect grew a towering sense of superiority, an unshakable conviction that he was intellectually and morally above the common man and the society they inhabited. The laws and customs that governed others were, in his mind, trivialities meant for lesser beings. This belief was the seed from which his criminality would sprout. It began, as it often does, with small transgressions, petty thefts, acts of defiance against a world he felt had wronged him. Each successful crime, no matter how small, reinforced his ego, solidifying his belief that he could outsmart anyone. At the age of 20, he made his way to the United States, drawn by the promise of a land where, he believed, a man of his talents could finally achieve the recognition he deserved. He settled in Dryden, New York, where his intellect did indeed open doors. He secured a position in a law office, impressing his employers with his quick grasp of legal theory, while simultaneously pursuing his own autodidactic studies in the burgeoning field of botanical medicine. It was in this small town that he encountered Harriet Shutt. At 18 years old, she was beautiful, vivacious, and from a respectable family, everything that Rulloff was not. The attraction was immediate and powerful. For Edward, Harriet may have represented a form of legitimacy, a beautiful prize that would cement his place in society. For Harriet, perhaps it was the dangerous allure of his intense intellect, the magnetism of a man who spoke with such passion and conviction. Her family, however, saw past the charm. They perceived the instability lurking beneath the surface, the arrogance that bordered on contempt, the subtle darkness in his eyes. They opposed the union with every fiber of their being, warning Harriet that Rulloff would only bring her ruin and disgrace. Tragically, their intuition would be vindicated. Ignoring their pleas, Harriet married Edward. The couple moved to the nearby farming community of Lansing, with Edward painting a picture of a future filled with academic prestige and intellectual pursuits. But the veneer of happiness, if it ever truly existed, soon cracked and crumbled. Rulloff's professional ambitions were constantly thwarted. Despite his genius, he failed to secure the esteemed university positions he so desperately craved. This failure was a poison that seeped into his personal life, turning his home into a pressure cooker of resentment and rage. The erudite scholar morphed into a domestic tyrant. The sounds of passionate intellectual debate were replaced by the chilling sounds of arguments and violence. Neighbors began to hear screams emanating from the Rulloff household and soon witnessed Edward's brutality firsthand. Harriet, the once vibrant young woman, became withdrawn and gaunt, a prisoner in her own home, bearing the physical and emotional scars of her husband's rage in silence. The birth of their daughter, Priscilla, did nothing to soothe his temper. If anything, the baby became another target for his frustration, a symbol of the mundane life he felt trapped in, another drain on his meager resources. The darkness that had long been brewing within Rulloff was reaching a boiling point. In the summer of 1845, the tragedy escalated beyond the walls of his home. Harriet's cousin, Amelia, and her young daughter fell gravely ill. Rulloff, ever the man of science, offered his services, preparing concoctions from his knowledge of botanical medicine. A short time later, both mother and child were dead. In an era where infant and adult mortality were high, no one suspected foul play. It was dismissed as a tragic coincidence. Yet, looking back, the incident stands as a sinister prelude to the true horror that was to come. 2 weeks after these convenient deaths, on the 23rd of June, 1845, Harriet Rulloff and her baby daughter, Priscilla, vanished from the face of the earth. The last confirmed sighting of Harriet was by a neighbor, to whom she had gone to borrow a piece of soap. She seemed normal, if perpetually sad, but nothing that indicated the tragedy that was to come. Hours later, the impensable happened. That same night, under the cover of darkness, Rulloff was seen borrowing a horse and a large wagon from a neighbor, claiming he needed to make a journey. On the wagon, 2 large, heavy wooden chests. He left and returned the next morning, alone. When asked about his family, his answers were evasive, a web of contradictions. He claimed Harriet had left him. When days turned into weeks with no sign of Harriet or Priscilla, concerned neighbors finally forced their way into the house. They found it in disarray, clothes strewn about, evidence of a hasty departure. Critically, all of Harriet's and Priscilla's belongings were still there. A mother fleeing her abusive husband would not leave everything behind, especially not her child's clothes. Edward Rulloff had also vanished. For a month, the city of Lansing lived in a state of suspense and speculation. The prevailing theory was clear and horrifying. The abusive and arrogant husband had finally succumbed to his violent nature, murdered his family, hidden their bodies in those heavy chests, and disposed of them before fleeing. But then, in a display of supreme arrogance, Rulloff returned. He reappeared as if nothing had happened, brazenly claiming Harriet had abandoned him, running off to Ohio. His story convinced no one, least of all Harriet's vengeful brother, Ephraim Shutt. Realizing his time was up, Rulloff fled once more. Ephraim led a posse in pursuit, and this time, the genius was captured and handed over to justice. The trial that followed was one of the most frustrating in New York's legal history. The prosecution was certain of Rulloff's guilt but faced an insurmountable legal hurdle, the principle of corpus delicti. Without the bodies of Harriet and Priscilla, there was no physical proof of a murder. Edward Rulloff, with his sharp legal mind, expertly exploited this loophole. The murder charge was dropped. He was convicted instead on the lesser charge of abduction and sentenced to 10 years of hard labor at Auburn Prison. For the grieving family and the horrified town, it was a profound miscarriage of justice. The search for the bodies in Cayuga Lake was exhaustive but yielded nothing. Harriet and Priscilla Rulloff had simply been erased. In the harsh confines of Auburn Prison, Rulloff did not languish. He flourished. He reinvented himself as an intellectual martyr, a model prisoner who spent his days immersed in his scholarly passions. He delved deeply into philology, the science of language, believing he was on the verge of a groundbreaking discovery that would unlock the very origins of all human communication and secure his place in history. His erudition was so potent, his arguments so convincing, that he managed to charm even the prison warden, who granted him special privileges, allowing him to tutor other inmates. It was here, surrounded by stone and iron, that he cultivated his next circle of pawns. Albert Jarvis, the impressionable son of the prison's own deputy warden, became his most devoted disciple, completely enthralled by the criminal's genius. He also befriended another inmate, a seasoned burglar named William "Billy" Dexter. Rulloff wasn't just passing time. He was forging alliances, building a new crew. He knew the murder accusations would follow him forever. He couldn't afford to wait for his release. Escape was his only logical path. In the spring of 1857, having manipulated his way into the absolute trust of the prison staff through their own son, Edward Rulloff, with Albert Jarvis at his side, vanished from his cell. He was once again a free man, but he was far from reformed. He was now a seasoned convict, a fugitive, with a new, loyal crew at his disposal. His formidable intellect was no longer just for academic pursuits. It was now fully dedicated to the art and science of crime. For over a decade, Rulloff, Jarvis, and Dexter lived as ghosts, moving across New York, a nomadic gang of thieves. They adopted a myriad of pseudonyms, their identities shifting like the shadows in which they operated. They were a trio bound by crime, led by the brilliant and utterly corrupt mind of Rulloff, always one step ahead of the law, until their arrogance finally led them to a quiet town and a fatal mistake. The final chapter in the bloody saga of Edward Rulloff unfolded on a sweltering July night in 1870. The target was Halbert's, a large and prosperous dry goods store in Binghamton, a prize Rulloff believed was ripe for the taking. His crew consisted of his two trusted associates, Albert Jarvis and Billy Dexter. The plan, as with everything Rulloff orchestrated, was meticulous. But it failed to account for two critical variables: blind chance and human bravery. The night watchmen on duty were not a pair of sleepy, elderly men. They were Frederick Merrick, a young man of only 18, filled with a sense of duty, and his partner, Gilbert Burroughs. As the trio of burglars forced their way into the dark, silent store, they were immediately confronted. What ensued was not a simple robbery, but a brutal, chaotic melee. Merrick, though young, fought with the heart of a lion. His own firearm misfired, a cruel twist of fate, but he did not falter. He grabbed a small stool and used it as a weapon, desperately trying to fend off the intruders. At the same time, Gilbert Burroughs grappled fiercely with another of the attackers. Amidst the grunts of struggle and the crash of merchandise, Rulloff's cold, intellectual demeanor shattered, revealing the killer that had always been lurking beneath. He leveled his pistol and, with no hesitation, fired a shot that echoed through the building. The bullet struck Frederick Merrick, ending his young life instantly. The sound of the gunshot transformed a bungled robbery into a capital crime. The burglars fled in a blind panic, a disorganized scramble toward the nearby Chenango River, which they believed was their only path to escape. But in the disorienting darkness, Jarvis and Dexter, perhaps following Rulloff's frantic lead, made a fatal miscalculation. Believing the river to be shallow, they plunged into its waters, only to be seized by the powerful, unseen current. They were swept away, their cries for help quickly silenced by the gurgling, black water. Rulloff, the eternal survivor, the puppet master, watched his pawns drown and once again melted into the night. The days that followed brought a creeping horror to the town of Binghamton. First, the shocking discovery of Frederick Merrick's body inside the ransacked store. Then, the grim retrieval of two more bodies, bloated and nearly unrecognizable, from the river downstream. The city was in an uproar. The police had two dead criminals but knew the ringleader, the man who pulled the trigger, was still at large. The testimony of the surviving watchman, Gilbert Burroughs, was critical. He provided a clear description of the third man, the leader. A citywide manhunt began, and the description matched a peculiar newcomer who had been noticed around town, a well-spoken but suspicious man of about 50. He was apprehended at the train station as he attempted to flee. Initially, he provided a false name, Charles Augustus, and coolly denied everything. But the threads of his past were beginning to unravel. In an extraordinary moment of coincidence, an elderly judge named Ransom Balcom recognized the captured man. He had presided over a trial in Ithaca decades ago. This was no common thief. This was Edward Rulloff. The name was a shockwave. The learned murderer, the boogeyman from Lansing, had resurfaced. And this time, the evidence was ironclad. Beyond the eyewitness testimony, investigators found clues in the dead criminal's pockets linking them to Rulloff, including the name of a Brooklyn lawyer who knew him under an alias. But the most damning evidence was a single, overlooked object left at the crime scene: a pair of custom-made Oxford shoes, one of which was uniquely designed to fit a man with a deformed left foot, a club foot. It was a rare deformity, a deformity that Edward Rulloff possessed. In front of the sheriff and witnesses, the shoe was slipped onto his foot. It was a perfect, damning fit. The trial of Edward Rulloff was a media spectacle. Newspapers dubbed it the trial of the century. The courtroom was a theater, packed day after day with spectators morbidly fascinated by the man who was both genius and monster. The prosecution, led by the relentless Peter Hopkins, built an unshakable case, painting a picture not just of a single murder, but of a lifetime of deception and evil. Rulloff's defense lawyer, hired by his now prosperous and estranged brother, tried desperately to sow doubt. They argued self-defense. They claimed evidence was planted. But it was Rulloff himself who took center stage. In a final, desperate act of narcissistic grandstanding, he wrote and distributed an autobiography from his cell, portraying himself as a martyr of science, a misunderstood genius persecuted by an ignorant society. His eloquence was spellbinding, his intellect still razor-sharp. But it was a hollow performance. The jury saw through the charade. They deliberated for only a few hours. The verdict was swift and unanimous: guilty of murder in the first degree. The sentence: death by hanging. In his final days, the facade of the cool intellectual finally cracked, giving way to the raw terror of a cornered animal. He wrote frantic letters, begging the governor for a pardon, but his notoriety and the brutality of his crimes had sealed his fate. On May 18, 1871, Edward Rulloff was led to the gallows in the courtyard of the Binghamton jail. It would be the last public hanging in the state of New York, a grim milestone for a grim man. His final words, uttered to the executioner, became a final, chilling piece of his own legend: "Hurry it up! I want to get to hell in time for dinner." But his death was not the end of his story. His body was immediately claimed by scientists from Cornell University. The myths and whispers about his prodigious intellect had created an intense scientific curiosity. They performed an autopsy, driven by the desire to understand what could create such a paradoxical being. Their findings were astonishing. Edward Rulloff's brain was one of the largest ever recorded by science, significantly larger than the average human brain. It was carefully removed and preserved in a glass jar. It became the prize of the university's Wilder Brain Collection. And there it remains to this day, floating in pale liquid, a grotesque monument to a man whose genius was matched only by his capacity for evil. It is a silent, chilling testament to a life of horrific crimes and a profound, disturbing question about the nature of intelligence and its dark potential. It serves as a stark reminder that the brightest light of intellect, when unguided by empathy or morality, can cast the darkest and most inescapable of shadows.